Check out this clip from a recent episode of Booked on Rock. Richard Houghton, the author of Is Everybody Ready for the Next Band? The Rolling Stones 1969 U.S. Tour, December 6, 1969, Altamont Speedway, the dark flip side of the Summer of Love. The Hells Angels crashed with concertgoers. Meredith Hunter, an 18-year-old attendee, was seen pulling a gun near the front of the stage. Hells Angel Alan Pissarro stabbed Hunter multiple times and killing him. Now you get the stories in the book here that really give you an idea of the atmosphere and what went down that night. One talks about how LSD was everywhere. This is Joe Pruss. He was right there up front, but eventually managed to get the hell out of there. He left that area. The general consensus is that people really could sense that things were going in the wrong direction and the anxiety kept building.
Yeah, I mean, again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But I think now we can all recognize that trying to organize a show in less than 72 hours, I think it was, by the time they fixed on the Altamont location, was absolutely crazy. Weeks, months of planning goes into putting on a big show now. And the idea that it could be set up and that it would run smoothly when they were building a stage literally from scratch, when there were no facilities in the area, just seems absolutely nuts now. And the death of Meredith Hunter was clearly a tragedy, but in some ways it's a miracle that there weren't more people hurt or seriously injured as a result of trying to put on a show at such short notice with a lack of proper facilities for people. I mean, ironically, there's a story in the book where one person said they enjoyed the show, they went home, they didn't see any trouble. But clearly the people who've given me stories for the book don't remember it that way. You know, there were lots of people who'd done a lot of acid who were clearly not well. It got really cold because the Bay Area was further north than LA, and people who were coming up from LA hadn't necessarily expected the weather to be like that. So it sounds like it was pretty miserable. I mean, I would have loved to have seen the Stones on that tour in 1969, but I'm really glad I wasn't at Altamont.
Yeah, one fan, James Pagliasotti, talks in the book about the intimacy of those shows, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And that's something that would change. He said, quote, the stage was raised, obviously, but not very high. And actually, there were people with their elbows on the stage while the Stones were performing. It was that intimate. And even though they were starting to play to much larger crowds, there was still that intimacy. That really changed in 72. That's the quote from James Pagliasotti. And again, I would think that the Altamont concert would lead to those changes in the future, drastic changes in security and the way things were going to be set up, right, from that point forward?
Yeah, there's the famous, infamous story about the Hells Angels apparently taking a contract out on Mick Jagger because Mick blamed the Angels for the security or lack of security at the show. And some of this goes back to the Hyde Park show in London back in July, where the Hells Angels in England provided some sort of informal security for the London show. But people made the point that the Angels in the US were not the kind of nice guys that the Angels in England were. So in England, they were just a bunch of guys who had motorbikes and drank a lot of beer and wore leather jackets, pretty much. Whereas in the US, they were much more of a gang. There was more criminality involved, and these guys were not to be messed with. So the Stones version of events was that the Grateful Dead suggested that the Angels could provide security. And this is one of the products of trying to put a show together in 72 hours. Nobody gave much thought to it. Nobody thought there'd be real issues. So letting the Angels run the show seemed like a good idea and a quick fix. Nobody actually thought, well, what are the downsides to that? So when Mick blamed the Angels for what happened at Altamont, and then this rumoured contract was taken out on Mick allegedly never stood still on stage after that because he was always worried about being shot at.
Wow. Yeah, he was spooked. Now, there was a Hell's Angel, and it's in the book. years later, maybe sometime in the 80s, came up to him and said that was not true. There was no hit on you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's be clear. If you're a public figure who lives in the spotlight and you're Mick Jagger or you're Paul McCartney, it must be really, really difficult if you step out the door every day thinking, well, everybody knows who I am. That means there's some crazy people out there. You know, when John Lennon was shot, that must have been so difficult for everybody who had a similar level of fame, because they suddenly realized that could have been them and it could still be them. So you've got to, and I don't know how you do it, but you've got to put all that kind of stuff aside and just try and get on with your life. But I'm sure for Mick and lots of people in the public eye, it meant they had to look again at their security arrangements, and can they ever step out the front door and walk to the shops and buy a pint of milk? Maybe not, or maybe not without a bodyguard.
You write in the afterward quote that the 1969 tour of the United States now forms a significant part of the Rolling Stones legend is indisputable. Altamont capped off a tumultuous year that included Brian Jones' dismissal, Mick Taylor joining the band, Brian's death, the Hyde Park show, and Marianne Faithfull's suicide attempt whilst in Australia with Mick Jagger. But you also know that this tour also set the template for how rock bands would tour in the future. So talk about that. We'll finish with that and what impact this tour had, in your opinion.
Well, if we leave Altamont out of it, because that was an aberration in terms of the way it worked out, the rest of the tour was properly planned. It sold out. You know, you couldn't get a ticket. There was a clamour for tickets. The Madison Square Garden shows were massively oversubscribed in terms of people trying to get hold of tickets. So the tour was a success. The band, you know, played those numbers live. The shows all went well. And if they'd gone home after the West Palm Beach show, we wouldn't be talking about Altamont. We'd be talking about what a roaring success the 1969 tour was. Clearly, come 1972, when the Stones came back to play North America for the first time, they'd learnt things in 1969, and some of the things they'd learnt were put into practice in 1972. They played some of the same cities. They played some different places because they wanted to play off the beaten track a little bit. And they made more money. Ticket prices went up again. The tour grosses went up. The clamour for tickets went up. And 1969 attracted lots of headlines. 1972 was a bigger show again and a bigger success again. And everybody from coming over from Britain to play learned from what the Stones learned from those 69 and 72 tours in terms of where to play, what kind of cities to choose. And it's still true today. You know, British bands often play the East Coast, they'll play Chicago, they'll come down the West Coast. And there are large swathes of the US where a British touring band wouldn't necessarily think to play because they see the big markets as being the Eastern Seaboard, the Pacific Coast, and the places like Cleveland and Chicago.
Really set the template for what was to come.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a book on the Faces, and the Faces famously were selling out cities like Detroit in 1969, 1970 after Rod Stewart joined the band, and they started out as a small Faces before rebranding as Faces. In England, they were still playing pub gigs. You know, they couldn't get arrested in England, and they're playing 3, 4, 5,000 seater venues in the US, and coming back 2 weeks later and playing again because people wanted to hear them play. So they learned some of the stuff that the Stones had found out from their touring shows. And as we talked about, Zeppelin did the same. Jethro Tull did the same. You know, bands that found an audience in the US found those audiences mainly around the big cities in the north of the country.
Don't miss the full conversation, available wherever you listen to your podcasts.